Day. If you've just joined us, it's Morning Live that you're watching, and it's day 11 of the nationwide lockdown. Now, political parties have criticised government for relaxing some of the regulations that were aimed at minimising the spread of the coronavirus. The Inkatha Freedom Party says that the amendments are causing confusion and anxiety, while the leader of the economic freedom fighters, Julius, labelled government as cowards. And some regulations were relaxed last week. For example, the number of passengers that taxis may transport, and also allowing informal food traders to operate, provided they have a permit from their municipality. Operating hours for minibus taxis were also extended. So to discuss these developments further, we're joined by political analyst, Dr. Sithembile Mbete, on the line to us via Skype. Thanks so much for your time this morning and welcome to Morning Live.
Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here.
So, Dr. Mbete, evidently these relaxations of the regulations is not sitting well with political parties, but evidently also not with some citizens who are quite concerned and have also expressed their dissatisfaction, especially with regard to the social distancing that this was meant to impart. And we've seen these messages via social media. What does that mean to you, what the government has done last week?
Indeed. So I think that, the government's been in quite a tough place, and I think many governments around the world are, in dealing with this issue because it's an unprecedented one. And a lot of the work of trying to address this is happening as they go along, because this virus is a moving target. And implementing this kind of lockdown, and particularly this kind of lockdown in a democracy and in a country as unequal as South Africa, was always going to be incredibly difficult. And there is no tried and tested model for how you do it necessarily in a context like ours. So I think that, the expectation that the regulations that we were going to have were going to be perfect from the beginning, I think is an unrealistic one. I think, though, that what the issue has been for government has been some of the inconsistency in communicating the regulations and some of the inconsistency in the implementation of some of the regulations. So what you saw on Thursday and Friday was a change around the transport regulations, going from 50% capacity in taxis, then to 100%, then back to 70%, all within a matter of hours, which really created confusion not only within the industry, but also amongst the people that would be using taxis themselves. I think some of the changes in regulations were really unfortunate and unnecessary, and could have been anticipated. So, for example, banning informal traders from doing their work in the first set of regulations, while allowing spaza shops and allowing supermarkets to do their work, was an unnecessary thing, especially given that what we were told by various other ministers was that the aim was to have people do their shopping as close to home as possible. And so informal traders should have been able to start operating from the beginning, and they weren't allowed to. And so having this belated change last week really created confusion, and according to some informal traders, actually was too late because they'd missed the opportunity. And so, I think that what we're seeing is the consequence of implementing something that has really never been done before, and trying to figure it out as government goes along. And that's not a uniquely South African problem. I think that's a challenge that all governments that are trying to do this are facing.
But as you indicate, Dr. Mbete, some of these could have been, should have been anticipated. And then we see somewhat of a pushback, if you will, from the public, where they are simply not adhering to the regulations. What does this indicate to government with regard to how their leadership and their sense of direction is being interpreted, especially given that there was also that threat by the taxi associations to go on a strike unless they were heard, and we saw what subsequently happened there?
Look, I think that, the problem with having these kinds of changes in regulations is that people then stop taking them very seriously. And so people interpret the inconsistency as a chance for them to break some of the rules and to find loopholes. And I think that we've certainly seen that over the past few days, both from ordinary citizens, but as you say, also from certain industries. And so what I think that the lesson should be for government from here is to act with greater consistency in its messaging. And part of the problem, I think, that we've had is that there's no sense of there being a central place where this is being project managed from. We know that there is the National Command Council, but what seems to be happening is that different ministers are interpreting the decisions of that National Command Council differently and are communicating those things differently. And so I think that something that the government should be learning from this is that we need not only a consistency in the written rules, but we need a consistency in the interpretation of those rules and regulations, because the regulations in some areas are written so generally that it allows for a great deal of interpretation, and it is in that interpretation that the loopholes come in.
Now, we saw last week Dr. Mbete, Transport Minister Sithembile Mbete, engaging with the taxi industry. What was your opinion, firstly, on what has seen as the backtracking, the toing and froing in terms of the decisions with regard to how the taxi operators would operate? Because many are now saying that was actually the beginning of a further relaxation of regulations, because government unable to hold to account the taxi industry and lay down the law. What's your view on that?
Look, we were told from the time that the initial state of disaster was declared and the social distancing measures, we were told that there was ongoing industry consultation going on, that the government was consulting a large number of stakeholders, so whether that was retailers to the mining industry and traditional leaders, religious leaders, and the taxi industry was one of them. And so to have these kinds of issues recurring with the taxi industry firstly raises questions about the extent of the consultation that the Ministry of Transport undertook with the taxi industry in the time before the lockdown itself actually came into place. But secondly, I think highlights the uncertain or the ill-defined role and status of the taxi industry there, right? That on the one hand, it is an informal industry. Certainly the drivers of within the taxi industry are classified as informal workers and members of the economy. But yet it is this very formalized lobbying structure that has a great deal of power because it is the backbone of public transport in South Africa, and will leverage that power and will use that power for its own interests whenever it can. And I think that what government has done is that it's placed itself into a weaker position than the industry by chopping and changing its own regulations to the whims of the industry, but also by not using its own capacity. So, we've seen basically what government has done is that it's decided that the public transport network that will be used the most during this lockdown is the taxi industry and not public services like buses and like trains. And so basically government has placed itself in a position where it is reliant on the goodwill of the taxi industry, and that's perhaps not the best decision to have made. And so what we're seeing basically is an industry that has got power, but also that's been put into a position where it is central to the functioning of other parts of the lockdown, using that power to its best interest.
So It's perhaps easier to highlight the shortcomings when it comes to the taxi industry. But what about big business? What about mining, for example? At a time like this, when the world is essentially under lockdown, when one thinks of things like coal, you think, OK, we need the coal because Eskom needs to keep running. We need to keep the lights on. But when we think of things like iron ore, are those essential at this stage of the lockdown, would you believe, Dr. Mbete?
So the mining question is a challenging one because basically mining is a major source of revenue for the country and brings in a great deal of foreign currency. And so in the context of a Moody's downgrade and all of those things, shutting down the mining industry completely from production, even just for 3 weeks, would mean that once things then open up, there would not be the product to export to industries that are already opened up, to countries that are already opened up, particularly in this case, China. And so it's that awful balancing act that's being taken place here, balancing the health of society broadly and the health of miners in particular against the health of the economy. And it seems that what government has chosen is that to try to maintain some of the health of the economy, even if that comes at the cost of possibly undermining the lockdown and broader health outcomes. It is it's an unpleasant and probably and some would say unjust calculation that the government has made, but it certainly seems that that is the calculation that's being made. I think that what the biggest concern is whether the industry, so whether the mining industry, but then also other industries, retailers that are being allowed to operate, are being held accountable for ensuring the safety of the workers in those industries. And I don't think that that is happening as consistently as it should. And so we've heard from people that work with and in the mining industry, but then also people that work in other industries, that workers aren't being sufficiently protected from this virus, whether that's being given protective clothing, whether that's being given hand sanitizers, whether that's being allowed to have sort of staggered working times. And I think that government should be doing a much greater role of oversight and also of holding industry accountable for that.
And the other big concern is, of course, economic recovery. We weren't doing great prior to the advent of the coronavirus pandemic, but now it seems that picture is much bleaker. So what would you say is the kind of pressure that government is under right now with regard to the effect of the economy and how exactly it needs to recover? And I also want you to perhaps touch on the Solidarity Fund and the safety net that should be in place or perhaps isn't quite in place yet for small, medium and micro enterprises.
Look, I think this lockdown and this crisis as a whole is going to have a devastating effect on the South African economy. It's having a devastating effect on the global economy as well. So we're going into a global recession. All the major economies of the world, perhaps with the exception of China at this stage, because it's been able to recover from COVID, are going to face major declines in the year, and South Africa's situation is compounded with our own domestic issues, whether that's been downgraded to junk by Moody's and by other ratings agencies. We were already going to have an economy that was going to grow at a very low rate. And so we are going to face major difficulties in our economy. I think there's going to be major job losses. We've already seen news of several small businesses shutting down and closing. And we know that small business is the bedrock of the economy as far as employment goes. And so I think it goes without saying that we're going to be in a recession. after this crisis, and we're going to be in continued economic crisis. I think that we need to differentiate between the fund that is there to help small business, and we've yet to see how effective that's going to be and how quickly it's going to get on board, because small businesses need a lifeline now. They don't need it in 3 months. If we don't want small businesses to shed jobs or to shut down completely, we need to be giving them a way to be able to continue or to hold on while this lockdown continues, so that they can start operations again afterwards. And so the delay in that process, I think, is one of great concern. The other thing then that we need, and that's where the solidarity fund comes in, is that we need to provide social relief and economic relief for ordinary people while this crisis is going on. There's a big thing that's being repeated all over the global south and all over Africa, that you can't expect people to lock down when they're hungry. And we had this lockdown kind of accommodate or happen when people were getting paid and at the end of the month. But the longer it goes on, I think the more difficult it will be for people to sustain themselves. So having food assistance, having cash assistance for people is going to be really important if we want to maintain the lockdown, not only for the next 2 weeks, but possibly even if it needs to be extended if we don't flatten the curve as is necessary.
And we know that that wouldn't necessarily be the best option, government indicating that they would not like to extend the lockdown, but we've seen in other countries where it's had to be extended. So what's your opinion regarding this one?
Look, my opinion is something that Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is advising the American president, he said that, you take your cue from the virus. That we are all subject to how much the virus is spreading and what damage the virus is doing. And so if the government feels that the spread of the virus is under control within the next 11 days and we can end the lockdown, then so be it. But if it is not, then I think that we must, that they'll need to consider some kind of extension, because the issue here is to curb the spread of the virus through the population. And that needs to be held paramount, right? And so the virus, I think, and the spread of the virus will determine how long or short this lockdown is.
Well, thank you so much for your time this morning. And political analyst speaking to us this morning, Dr. Sithembile Mbete, just to give a sense, her view on what we are dealing with and also what has happened over the last week or so. At 7 o'clock, let's bring you